Should I explain bronies to you, or?
Welcome to Geek Tangent, Episode 3. My name is Chris.
And I'll be playing Doug.
I'm Keith.
And I'm Stefan.
So here we are, episode number 3. We're even more officially recurring. We've got some great new topics for you this week. We're going to spend some time this evening talking about the recent debate between Apple and FBI with regards to personal privacy on mobile devices. We're going to move on and spend a little bit of time talking as well about wearables, our own experiences with it, what we like about them, what we hope to like about them in the future. We're going to close out the episode with something new. We're going to recommend some new podcasts for you, some other things to listen to besides Geek Tangent, of course. Each of us has a fresh recommendation for you, something great for you to check out and spend your time listening to. However, before we get into our first topic, we thought it might be worthwhile to take a few minutes and sort of catch up with each other, see what's going on. Anybody got some fun things they've been up to this past week?
Well, me, I have twice a year locally. There's a guitar show that's kind of like it's like a flea market. Only it's nothing but people selling guitars and amps and pedals and all that kind of bullshit that I spend too much money and time on. So I went to one of those this past weekend. I was sending Chris pictures of guitars and stuff as I was finding them.
He's torturing you, basically.
Yeah. Although this time I didn't actually buy any guitars. I'm in a room with like 15 guitars already, and my wife is as long as I have places to put them and I can keep them all in one room, she's cool. So
I'm right with you.
The walls are getting covered. There's a couple on the floor, but whatever. I ended up buying a bunch of pedals. I got a pretty serious problem with pedals, and I actually started giving design recommendations to a company that makes pedal boards. It's perforated with all these holes. It looks like a design that I made years ago, and I've been writing back and forth with this guy, telling him how to improve stuff because he has made some of the same mistakes I made a couple years back. So anyway, it's been interesting.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Obviously, I went and visited Keith a couple of years ago, or maybe it was just last year, I can't remember, to one of those shows, and it really is actually a lot of fun. We got into some good trouble with that one.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, but it's
actually, come to think of it, we have a YouTube link to include referencing that.
That's true.
All right, so recently the people have been playing the Division beta, and that closed. I think it was last week or the week before.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this game's it's a Clancy game. It's never going to carry itself. And then today, they just announced a whole year's worth of content, and I was like, fuck. So I'm really hoping Destiny steps up their game and can compete, because I'm a little scared now.
Well, are you scared because you're afraid people will bail from Destiny to go to the Division and sort of leave you with the tumbleweeds, or do you think you're actually interested enough in it to dive and give?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I honestly didn't like the game that much, but if all my friends go over to play it, I'm gonna go pick it up and play.
I was gonna say I got the impression a lot of people weren't thrilled with the Division, and it's one of those things. Like, I'm starting to wonder. There's a reason you don't see demos much anymore. Demos just give people a reason not to buy the game. Like,
that's true.
Star Wars Battlefront, like the demo turned more people away than turned them on.
It's just like when a movie does too much marketing,
Yeah.
Well, some of these games like that, I mean, these are pretty dense games as well. And I played the Division beta as well. I got into the first one as well, and I like it. Visually, it's cool. I don't love it to death, but the thing I really walked away was there better be more story to this, because essentially, of course, it's a demo and they're not baking everything into it. They're basically just sort of letting you play around with the mechanics of it. Yeah. And I feel like that if they can actually layer a solid storyline behind it, then that's going to make a world of difference. So I kind of don't have any horse in this race, but I would be interested to see what the final product looks like. And I wouldn't be surprised if even what little stuff we've all gotten to do in the beta so far is a lot better if it's enhanced with a good story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be key to them really taking that game to the next level. Hopefully they will sort of learn from all the blowback that Bungie got over Destiny, and the fact that the storyline aspect of it was far from compelling.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that there's a chance that they learn from that and will make that more a bigger part of the actual game release. I mean, yeah, I think with a beta, they are looking as much to just debug and make sure that they've got server capacities measured correctly and run into figure out shit like I think I saw an article about how some players in the beta figured out a way to make their characters walk on air.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and that's a large part of what betas are for is
Yeah,
to just
totally.
get a much bigger user base and actually try to poke holes in in the game code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because they've learned they can have a room full of game testers. Some of these games are so big, you'd have to have the only way to have millions of hours of playtesting is that to open up a beta to
Oh
everybody.
yeah, look at
Yeah.
any Bethesda game. It's just like we're gonna make something and put it out there, and people are gonna find shit that's wrong with it, but we're still gonna
Yeah,
put it.
yeah, we're basically they're paid beta testers essentially,
Yeah.
or unpaid, I guess I should say.
Yeah.
Did you guys see? This just came out today. We're recording on the evening of the 3rd here. Amazon. We've talked about the Amazon Echo in the past. Actually, one of our test episodes. But Amazon just released 2 new Echo-based devices. Did you guys see these things?
I did not.
Yeah, they just announced it today. It's
I
called
saw
the Echo.
Dot. Yeah,
I'm sorry, what was that?
I saw the Dot. That's what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah, that's what I'm referring to. Yeah, they released the Echo Dot, I think they're calling it, or maybe it's just Amazon Dot. It's basically a hockey puck size version, like height wise, of the Echo.
Oh.
And it is essentially an Echo without the big speaker built in, essentially. So, you can still post queries to it and stuff like that. It looks like they're trying to make that something that you would have by your bedstand or as a small, more discreet thing in your house that you could talk to.
Hmm.
The ironic part is, although it's supposed to be a standalone device, right now the only way you can buy it is if you already own an Echo. So when I read about this, like you literally just go you speak to your Echo and say, Alexa, order the Amazon Dot, and it actually walks you right through the process. But although I haven't scored one yet, it looks like an interesting addition. I'm not quite sure where it's going to fit in, but
What's
and
the price point on it?
$90.
Yeah.
Whereas opposed to the Amazon Echo, when it was in beta, if you bought it early enough, I think it was was it 100?
I think it was $100. That's what I
Might have
remember
been.
paying.
And
Yeah.
I know now it lists for like 190 or 200, but I mean, it's a cool looking little device. I still like my Echo. And I know that there's a whole host of what they're calling skills,
Yeah.
which are basically plugins you can add that I haven't taken the time to explore it. So I suspect it's probably more useful than I'm giving it credit for.
I heard on
Mixed results.
Yeah, I heard on a podcast actually this morning. Somebody wrote into the host of a show I listened to, and he was going to how they have game jams where people just kind of go and they try to make a game in like a week or like 2 days.
Yeah.
They're doing that for the Echo to make apps, and people were talking
Cool.
about things they kind of wanted to see on the Echo, and somebody was like line by line, like when I'm cooking, I want it to read the recipe to me like line by line. I was like, that's brilliant idea. So
Yeah.
it was just cool that people are doing that stuff too.
Yeah, there's a second device that they released, and I have to admit I didn't look into it as closely as I did the Dot, and I'm afraid I'm blanking on the name right now, but it's basically a ramped up Bluetooth speaker. It seems to be a variation of the Echo. But I can't say I know too much more about it. The Dot definitely looked intriguing, though.
And the skills that have mixed results. Like there was one that was a bartender. That's kind of cool. You can ask it, how do I make a Mai Tai? How do I make a Tom Collins? And it'll, go through the recipe. So there's clearly, like Doug was saying, it'll read a recipe line by line if you want. So it has things, but some of it was kind of silly. Like they had on President's Day, president trivia. Well, I don't know if I need that, but okay. Some of it's kind of frivolous, but I appreciate the effort that there are always new things. I get an email from Amazon every week of here's what's new this week on your Echo.
Yeah.
And they're expanding it. They're trying things. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's definitely worth keeping an eye on as it goes forward. Anyhow, what do you guys say? You want to get on with it?
Let's do it.
All right.
Let's go.
Apple versus FBI. So we're back. Our main topic for episode number 3 is, perhaps not surprisingly, the current court case going on between Apple Computer, or just Apple these days, and the FBI. You're no doubt at least somewhat aware of this, but we thought we'd discuss it a little bit, maybe give you a high level overview in case you don't know some of the details, at least the details that matter, and maybe banter a little bit about the current state of it, where we think it might be going, and perhaps some of our personal opinions of it. So, to start with, in case you don't or aren't familiar with a lot of the details, of course, in early December, a married couple opened fire on a number of people in a health clinic out in San Bernardino, California. He is a US born citizen of Pakistani descent. His wife, she is a naturalized citizen through marriage with him. They were residents of California and obviously committed this act of terror, as it's typically called. Um, their act was, a day long thing, as we all know, the initial attack itself, and then a few hours of driving around. From what I've read, they were attempting to detonate a handmade bomb they'd left at the attack location before police hunted them down and killed the two of them. Of course, the big issue now is of all the evidence the FBI has collected in the aftermath of this includes an iPhone 5C that was in use by the man whose name I don't have in front of me. He was an employee of the Department of Health in California, and this is a department issued phone. So it's not his sole ownership, but it is, of course, locked. And the FBI has been unable to access the thing, which they are very interested in doing, under the assumption that there is potentially some useful contact information, communication information with whoever may have activated them or inspired them to do what they're doing. As it stands right now, of course, Apple is publicly saying, no, we will not. I'm bastardizing it by saying, no, we will not help you. But specifically, what the FBI is requesting is they want Apple to custom code a backdoor method by which that they can brute force the code password for the phone. Apple is refusing on principle grounds primarily. It is something that they could literally do, but it opens a whole can of worms. There are pros and cons to this whole thing, and I thought it might be interesting for us to talk a little bit about it. Anybody want to start us off?
I have a couple of points I'd like to make. Apple is very aware of what is actually at stake here, and it's obviously more than just one phone. It's more than the privacy of everyone who owns an iPhone. It's even bigger than that, even though you're talking about millions of people all over the world, not just in America. You're talking about millions of people's phones, their information, their data, and their privacy. So I thought Apple was very smart early on. This was, again, we're having this discussion the first week in March, and this was a couple weeks ago. Apple made a motion to say, listen, if we're going to try this case, the code that was written by Apple Computer is First Amendment protected speech. The reason they said that is once you're talking about something that is in the Bill of Rights, it's constitutional. So if we're talking constitutional law, that gets heard by the Supreme Court, period. I think they're very smart in to say, we're not going to start at some lower level court. We're not even going to start at a federal court. We're going to go right to the Supreme Court because it is that level of law that we're talking about, which I thought was very smart. There is no appeal. It gets heard by one court. They decide, period.
But isn't it going to take a while for this case to make it all the way up there? I mean, stuff doesn't get kicked up to the Supreme Court quickly, from what I understand.
If it's constitutional law, yes, it does, because that's all that they do is con law. They don't hear any other kind of case. So there's kind of nowhere else for it to be. You can, I guess, start in a federal court, but
well, I mean, the underlying case is already in federal court. I mean, there is the court order that was issued by the judge to Apple, ordering them to to do this for the FBI, and Apple is appealing that.
right. Well, but there hasn't actually been, there's not a judge assigned to it. It's not on any docket. Like there isn't a case. It's still just posturing because, we saw last week the director of the FBI testifying in front of Congress.
That was just like yesterday.
Yeah. And well, I was listening to the attorney representing Apple, and of course, he knows a lot more about the case than what we see in the news media. And he let it be known to me anyway. The FBI has over 127 some odd cases where they were already asking for this to be done with iPhones. This is not One of the things I think is a huge flaw in the FBI's stance, the stakes aren't high enough. We're talking about two lunatics who blew up, showed up at their own office where they work to shoot up their coworkers who are attending a party. This isn't some mastermind plan by ISIS, somewhere out in Afghanistan or Pakistan. That's not what happened. These are two lunatics on the fringe who, maybe were influenced by stuff on the internet, blah,
Well,
blah,
to be
blah.
fair, they there is saying they do have connections to ISIS according to the.
Regardless, Doug, the stakes are way too low. If we were
Well,
talking September 11 kind of thing where,
still
you
killing
know,
people.
but
So
two people showing up into one little government office and shooting people gives you the right to unlock millions of phones. No, no, no. Stakes are too low.
no, I agree. I mean, that's not a good entry point for them to make the argument. And just before we kind of get down the more discussion, I want to go into a little more detail about the actual thing that FBI wants from Apple, which is basically if you enter 10 incorrect passwords in an iPhone, it automatically erases itself. So what they're wanting is what Chris mentioned. The backdoor is to give them some code that will let them enter unlimited password guesses and let them eventually open the phone. Um, and I guess that's kind of where it sets the precedent where that's going to allow the government to be able to force Apple engineers to rewrite code, and that's kind of the big issue there,
Apple
where it's just,
Apple came back and said, you could have asked us to make 1,000 copies of this phone, and then you could just on your own try. You'd have, those 10 chances per 2,000 copies, and you could brute force it without having to have a backdoor, couldn't you? The FBI didn't even ask for that.
There are a couple of interesting points I was reading about earlier today in prep for this. First of all, Apple, it turns out, has been in contact and in collaboration, for lack of a better term, with the FBI since very early January.
Yep.
And clearly, there are a couple of missteps taken by the FBI and perhaps the local police as well, insofar as I'm a little vague on this, but apparently what happened initially was the Department of Health, who again is the one who owns the phone, strangely, they changed the ownership of the iCloud account in an effort to get access to it. And then after that, that in combination with the FBI, I believe they may have actually used their 10 chances to enter the code. I'm a little unclear on that. So now they kind of unintentionally back themselves into a corner. Why not rely on Apple in the first place and not touch the damn thing
Mm-hmm.
without, listening to exactly what Apple has to say? Who knows? But yeah, to elaborate on what Keith was just saying, now they're in a position where, the FBI director who was in front of the judicial hearing yesterday or the day before was making it very clear, and he had some good points, to be fair. He was pointing out, like, look, write the backdoor code for this phone. You could keep it at Apple headquarters or whatever, execute it on this one phone, and then destroy the code. And Apple's response is just as appropriate, like, yeah, but you do this once, and like you said, Keith, the 125 other phones the FBI has on a backlog that they want to unlock, that's going to come up. The DA for Manhattan has already been quoted as saying he's got 75 some odd phones that he'd love to get access to, never mind about the rest of the planet. And so it's going to set a horrible precedent. And my understanding is that this is what Apple's really, one of their primary arguments is this sets a precedent where we're going to have to take this on a case by case basis and essentially rewrite this code every time so that it can subsequently be destroyed, so that there's no chance of it getting out or being used on other phones until the next person comes along and says, we have a subpoena for you to unlock this phone. It's just ridiculous.
It is.
Yeah, no, the argument that the FBI is making, that, well, you can just destroy this insecure version of the iOS, which was dubbed FBIOS in one article that I read, which I thought was quite clever. But the notion that Apple would write this code, install it once, and then destroy it again, like you said, that's just not going to happen, because you've got all these other courts that are going to make the same request, and once they grant that level of access once, it's the thin end of the wedge, slippery
Yeah.
slope
Yeah.
argument, but it's a
Very
very
much so.
valid one. And never minding the fact that writing such code is going to be a complex process. Invariably, you're going to
Mhm.
be using some sort of code. They're not going to be using GitHub, but they're going to be using some sort of source code management as they write it. And so you're going to have traces of that engineering work that are going to that are going to survive, and they're going to want to keep that code base. They're going to need to keep that code base around, otherwise they're going to be just sinking hours and hours of engineering time into rewriting that same functionality over and over and over again.
Yeah.
um Hey, one of the things to touch a little bit more on the technical side of it, I was doing a little bit of reading up on the iOS infrastructure and how it manages a lot of that sort of stuff. And so they have something called the Secure Enclave, which is it's essentially a separate computer, uh, running independently on the iPhone that is just managing those security aspects to it. It has its own firmware, and so the all the management of the retry counter and the timeouts, like one of the things that it'll do is you know for the first 5 attempts you can retry immediately. Then it increases, like it makes you wait a couple minutes before you can make a fifth attempt.
Mhm.
Then it slowly increments that up. I think after the ninth attempt you have to wait an hour before you enter that 10th attempt to load it. One of the things that's actually
Sounds
kind
like Candy Crush.
of one of the things that's actually kind of interesting about it is the notion of erasing the data. That's actually something that that's an individual per phone setting. Like if you go into your settings on your iPhone,
Yeah.
you have to actually turn on erasing the data after 10
Yeah.
lockouts.
What's the consequence after? Yeah, yeah.
And so what's interesting is I think that if they don't have that turned on, um that after that 10 lockout failure, I think you could arguably reset the clock. I haven't read enough about exactly what happens on the phone if it doesn't have the erase data component selected. Although it's arguably, well, if this were a more masterminded crime, I would say that it's arguable that that the erase data switch was set on for this phone. But I don't know that I necessarily give these guys that much credit as far as premeditating that level of protecting their contact data on the phone, because unless they use that phone specifically to download the pipe bomb instructions, um and I'm even that it I don't know that necessarily the FBI having that information from the phone is going to be that useful to them in the case anyway.
Right.
um
Let me ask you guys.
Well, I think the
And
main. Sorry, Chris. The one more thing.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think the main thing the FBI was suspecting from the phone, Stefan, in addition to like what might be on it, was like, the connection to ISIS and the contacts and the messages that are in there.
yeah,
I think that's one of the big things that they were looking for as
although I mean
well.
a certain
So
amount of
more
that
Chris.
metadata, as we all know, is already
Sure.
being collected.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right.
I read an interesting
Yeah.
article that was pointing out
Like
exactly that. It's
hours,
like
locations,
the
and stuff.
NSA has this stuff.
Yep.
I mean, they must have this stuff because the NSA is grabbing incoming communications from foreign countries, whereas the FBI is dealing with homeland type stuff. The NSA probably had, if there's anything out there, they could probably dig it up anyhow.
Yeah, as we learned after September 11, they take too long to process the data, and
Right.
it's well, I mean, this they've had all the time in the world, but generally speaking, they're useless because they can't get anything actionable quick enough.
Let me ask you real fast, short answer, and then we'll wrap it up. Am I correct in assuming that each of us sort of feels like Apple's on the right path here?
Yes,
Yes.
but I'm a privacy, I think Edward Snowden's a hero. Um, Julian
What?
Assange, I think, is a hero. I'm one of
Okay.
those people.
Sorry, Doug, you and Stefan, what do you guys think?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like rights versus justice here, and it's kind of depends on which side you want to be on here. But I think Apple's in the right. I mean, it's just going to open the floodgates for you know it's just one little thing that could happen that could spur this huge domino effect, and who knows whose hands that back door could end up in. So I'd
Yeah.
rather
Yeah, it's such a
protect the
slippery
rights
slope.
now and go from there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm generally speaking in Apple's camp on this as well. I mean, I think it is a little bit more nuanced in a lot of ways, because one of the
Sure.
things that's true is that the modern encryption does kind of introduce a whole new area of, prior to this kind of encryption, there was always the notion of, as long as the justice system went through all the appropriate hoops and got judicial review and all of that to say that, okay, no, yes, the government does deserve to have access to this block of information. Prior to modern encryption, sort of, there really wasn't, once you had that court order, there wasn't anything that would then prevent the government from getting access to that data. But about the only thing that maybe would be cognate was the notion of like a numbered Swiss bank account, and the fact that Swiss banks absolutely refuse to give out any information about who owns which numbered account. Um, there really wasn't a cognate of just all data was ultimately at some level eventually accessible by the government if that was deemed necessary by the judicial review system.
Mhm.
And so I can understand why the government views this level of encrypted data as, they're worried that there's this big black hole of data that they're never, ever, ever going to get their hands on. And so, I mean, I can understand why they feel like this is a different category.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, I do think that, I do generally side. I do think there is a right to privacy. In the U.S. Constitution, even though it's not spelled out as one of the, you know, the the Bill of Rights. And yeah, and the Supreme Court has essentially stated that there is, through the combination, largely the Fourth Amendment. But the fifth as well, and some of the others, that collectively there is a implicit right to privacy.
Oh yeah, First Amendment. You can't list
Unreasonable
all your
search and
rights.
seizure. Yeah, so I do think that Apple is in the right on this. But I do understand the government's perspective about the fact that, you know it it's not like they can, go into your place of business and say, we're subpoenaing all of your business records for the last 6 months. Yeah, they're previously, if they got the court order, then they would get all this data that they could then sift through. But yeah, uh, that's sort of my take on it.
So I thought this was kind of fitting to wrap this up, but when iOS 8 came out and Apple crafted their latest privacy statement, one of the things it says is that their commitment to user privacy doesn't stop for government information requests. So much like everybody else, maybe they should have read the agreement before they clicked accept.
That's great.
Well, needless to say, this is going to be one of those that's going to be continued probably for a little while. And needless to say, it has big ramifications. It's definitely going to be one we're all going to want to watch play out.
Hey, listener. You will hear each of us introduce topics for the show, but keep in mind that this is the Geek Tangent, and as varied as the topics are, we can always talk about even more, as long as it's at least tangentially related to our and your interests. Let us know what you think about the show. Contact us by email, contact@geek-tangent.com, or write a review of us on iTunes. It really does help us get noticed. And check out our YouTube channel at Geek Tangent Podcast on YouTube.
Welcome back to Geek Tangent. In this segment, we're going to be talking about wearable technology. And to kick things off, we're just going to go around the room and we're each going to list the various wearables that we've had experience with. For myself, I've really only ever worn the Fitbit, the very basic band. So, Keith, what have you been wearing?
I started off with an iPod Nano, and I eventually got a Jawbone UP, and quite recently I got myself a Fitbit. So I've had a few.
Yeah, so I haven't really had anything before the Pebble Round that I currently have, which is um, it's a smartwatch similar to the 360 and the Apple Watch, but it's e-paper and it's a lot lower functions, so it's kind of more basic notifications and and it's got the built-in health stuff, and I can see text messages but I can't reply. I can see emails but I can't reply. I can see appointments but I can't change anything. So it's basically just um, kind of like the entry-level smartwatch, but I love it because the form factor is great.
I've screwed around with a few things. I've had a Fitbit, the little clip version one. I've actually had 2 or 3 of them. I kept running them through the clothes machine. Um, I've also screwed around quite a bit with wrist-based things. The first one I got about a year and a half or 2 years ago was called the Razer Nabu, and at the time it was a beta product from Razer, a company more known for gaming laptops and hardware and stuff like that. It was actually a really cool bracelet, but it actually physically didn't hold up for long. I can come back to that later. After the Nabu started to really fail on me, that was right around the time that the Apple Watch was starting to come up. And although it sounded intriguing because it was sort of a more advanced version of the Nabu, really didn't like the look of it. So in lieu of that, and because I'm a cheapskate, I wound up getting my hands on a relatively inexpensive Moto 360, basically an Android-based smartwatch, and that's what I've been rocking to this day. So the Moto 360 I actually really like for a few reasons. I mean, it's a little big, but it is a round face, and that was a really key factor for me. My problem when I first got it was that it didn't talk at all to my iPhone. I'm an iPhone user, um, and I knew that when I bought the thing. But at the time, there were a couple of hacks that let you sort of join it via Bluetooth to get some basic functionality. And right around the time I was getting really fed up with that, Android finally released Android Wear software for iOS. This is just a few months ago, actually. And I have to say, I love it. Um, there is some functionality that you don't get. You're a bit limited. So, for example, the hack I was doing, I'll explain it very briefly. Before the iOS version of the software came out, I actually wound up going out and buying myself an Android phone, and I would leave it at home. And the Android Wear operating system is smart enough that if you compare your watch to a Wi-Fi network that your phone is also aware of. So, for example, I bring them both home, I pair them together, and I also have them paired at work at one point. So they're both aware of both networks. When I leave the phone at home and I have the watch at work, it still communicates over Wi-Fi with each other. So I would get my notifications sent by the phone over the internet onto the watch, which is pretty cool. Kind of limited the functionality, really. Of course, you had to be on a shared network and stuff like that. But anyhow, the iOS version comes out and it essentially provides you with basic step tracking and notification stuff. And I've come to find that that's really all I care about. That's also the only stuff my Nabu did as well. And now, having lived with the Moto 360 as primarily a notification transit device, essentially, um, I've come to realize I really don't need more from it. I don't want to use my watch as a replacement for a phone. I don't want to try and text from my watch unless if I could dictate it, that would be great, but you can't do that. And it just makes me realize more and more that the Apple Watch, by comparison, despite ignoring the fact that I don't like the way it looks, does more than at the end of the day, you only need a few things basically. So I've been pretty happy with that. Doug, I'm kind of curious. I know your Pebble watch is a really interesting device, and I'm kind of curious to hear what your outlook is on that sort of stuff.
So yeah, just to go in a little more in depth with what the Pebble is, the Apple Watch and the 360 are kind of full color. I think they're LCD displays, whatever the technology is, but the Pebble is e-paper, so the graphics and the kind of the fidelity of stuff is pretty low. It's more, it almost looks um, like a Game Boy. If you remember how a Game Boy looked, like it kind of had like the
Kind of
the
pixelated.
16-bit kind of pixelated look.
Mm-hmm.
So everything's very simple looking and very kind of utilitarian, which I kind of love about it. And I can get like 2 days of battery life out of it. Like using all the features, I can
Yeah,
just
that's
kind of
pretty cool.
go
That
nuts
is
with it,
impressive. Yeah.
and it'll last forever. And the form factor is I think it's the best out of all the smartwatches I've seen. It's the thinnest watch there is. It's round. Um, the band is small. I don't have big wrists, so I think a big watch would look kind of ridiculous on me. So it was not only like features, but it's also, well, look, you wear a watch, you want it to look good. Um, and so far I've loved it. I mean, it's once I kind of got over the hurdle of like, wow, this thing doesn't really do that much. That was kind of the charm of it after a while, because like Chris said, that's all I really need is notifications. If I have a
Yeah.
meeting coming up, it vibrates on my wrist. If I have a text, it comes in and vibrates on my wrist, and it's just a cool thing to like get my notifications on and be like, oh, I got a text, and I can just pick up my phone, which is always 2 feet from me anyway, and reply to it. So As to what Chris said, I mean, I think the Apple Watch is hideous, and I think it's a really bad misstep in terms of form and function, and more so in form. But seeming some of the stuff it does, it just seems a little ridiculous. Like, I don't want to draw a picture on my watch. I could care less about that. So I just, I really like the Pebble, and I think it was $250, but compared to like $499 and however much the Apple Watch is, feels like a pretty good deal to me.
Doug, when you
You know,
when you receive it, I'm assuming that the Pebble will notify you when somebody's calling you. It's got caller ID, right?
Yes. Yep.
Can you respond to it? And by that, I mean, can you just like dismiss the call, hang it up?
Yes.
Oh
Yep.
yeah. So
Yep.
I like that a lot. The Moto 360 does that, and it's a small thing, but it's actually really nice.
Yeah. And everything, and it's also, sorry, the Pebble is not a touchscreen, so it's all worked by two paddles on the left
Oh,
of
that
the
I didn't
face.
know. Okay.
Yeah. So it's just an up, down, left, right kind of function.
One of the other things that's worth pointing out, Doug, because although I haven't looked that much at your Pebble, and I'm not sure you described it this way, but the body itself is like ridiculously thin.
It's the thinnest there is. Yeah, it's crazy.
And
It's
it
a really
reminds me
nice.
a bit of Keith. There's a brand of watch that I know you're a big fan of. Is it Movado?
I have a Movado. I have a Skagen on my wrist right now, and the Skagen is like paper thin.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
it's the Skagen is what you're thinking of, Chris.
This is the watch for you, Keith.
Yeah.
yeah. It's a very cool. Doug's shown it to me briefly once or twice. It's really cool. And the only thing I would add on, or at least emphasize, is and it sounds like Doug's experience is the same. When I had my Moto connected to Android, i.e., I had access to all the apps you can download and install on it. Of course, I installed a whole bunch of crap, and you quickly learn like I don't need any of this. I don't need a map app on my phone. And it was actually a really good educational experience to realize what the practical use for wrist-based devices are. It's pretty
Yeah.
limited, but what
Yeah.
it does, those limited functions are actually very useful, I feel like.
Well, it's funny though, Chris, because you're, an iPhone, an iOS-based person who used an Android device. I am an Android-based person who absolutely loved his iPod Nano, which, by the way, the iPod Nano I still have in active use today is one that you gave me that you just weren't using. And when my old one broke from a common problem, by the way, the little power button breaks on it, you just sent me yours, and I was like, "Yay! I got my old fucking Nano back." So I've been using that old thing, and to me, the Nano, obviously doesn't connect to my phone or anything. I don't care about that. I don't need to get notifications of text and stuff. Like, I'll get to it, whatever. I don't need to respond to every fucking thing every friggin' minute. So I'm not that guy. The Nano had other functions I did like an FM radio. Um, Seriously, it has an FM radio in there. It's great. Yeah, you can get, there's all kinds of other functions it has besides iTunes is there. I can load a bunch of podcasts, use the pedometer, go walking. It'll tell you the time. You can have the radio. You can listen to a podcast. It's measuring your steps. This
Yeah.
is all useful stuff to
Okay,
me.
that's right there. I was on the verge of asking you, like, literally, how does this qualify as a wearable? But the pedometer thing, like, okay, that puts it in that wheelhouse, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, I've recently discovered how and where you wear the Nano. It's more or less accurate.
Don't
So
put it up
there,
your ass.
well, in truth, if you're wearing slacks, I work in an office, so and that
Did you
thing's
say
just in my
slacks?
pocket, like flying around in my pocket, so I can be sitting at my desk and just from moving around, my chair, whatever, it's counting steps erroneously. I got home from work yesterday and it said I did like, 10, 12 miles. Absolutely not. So,
You
for
wish.
that, that's a problem. So it depends where and how you wear it. I have the wristband so I can wear the Nano as a watch, and it's okay. It keeps good time. But Doug was saying his Pebble will last multiple days. My Nano, there are times by the end of the day it's dead, particularly if you're using all of those functions.
Yeah.
So it has its pluses, it has its minuses. One of the things I
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Keith.
liked about the Nano is feedback right there. You can see steps taken, distance, how long, minutes or hours it took you to walk that stopwatch, and you see it right there. I don't have to pull out my phone just to get feedback out of the device. I look at the device.
Yeah.
I got a Jawbone UP, which, by the way, if you do any research, you'll learn just like everyone else in the world, thing falls apart in 3 months. It's a piece of garbage. and it just has one little push button on it, and it will sort of give you feedback, but it's like, it'll tell your pulse, and it's this bullshit. Like, I used to have a Honda, and Hondas, when you're driving and you get the engine light comes on, it throws a code. Well, what that code is when you pull up the carpet on the passenger side, there's a little light, and the number of lights that it flashes, like Morse code style, tells the mechanic what's wrong. That was how it would give you feedback. Well, that's how the Jawbone Up is. It's the number of little things that flashes. It means, oh yes, you met your goal number of steps, or you're about to have a heart attack, or my battery's dead, or you don't know what the fuck it is unless you brought a manual.
It's just too cryptic, basically.
Right. So that was kind of my problem with that. The Fitbit is a little better. Like, it has the little button. It'll tell you how many steps, how many stairs, distance, that sort of thing. But it doesn't give you as much. Yes, once you get into the app, it'll, give you more feedback. But as did the Jawbone, by the way. But again, weak software, man. To have it track your sleep, you had to separately go in and tell it, add sleep. It'd count everything else. It'd count steps, your heart rate, and all this other biorhythm crap, and it would track your sleep. But just that one thing, you had to manually load your sleep every day.
So not your favorite device, basically.
No. So, the Fitbit for me is new. I literally just got it this week, and it's an improvement, but I still haven't found the perfect thing. Maybe I need to get a Pebble. Maybe I need an iWatch. I don't know.
Yeah, so Kev, you're saying it was for the Jawbone that you had to manually add your sleep data, or
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It was
because
terrible.
the Fitbit I have is the really bare bones entry level model, and mostly I just wanted to use it for tracking you know physical activity. Like, it doesn't even have the pulse rate monitor or any of that sort of shit. It really very much the bare bones. And the one thing I wish it could do, although I totally understand why it doesn't, is you don't have to manually add your sleep data, but you have to tell it when you're going to sleep.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and which is basically just you tap I like the wristband itself has no controls on it. It's just the little
Right.
bullet shaped sensor in a rubber wristband. But if you tap multiple times on the sensor, it'll go into its sleep mode, where it'll measure your activity with the knowledge that you're sleeping, and so it'll try to say, okay, well, you had this many hours of restful REM sleep, and this is how many times you woke up during the night, that kind of crap. And I can totally understand why you have to tell the device that you are trying to go to sleep, because fundamentally it can't distinguish between slothfulness and just general inactivity
Yeah.
and actually being asleep.
The four of us all drive a desk for a living, so the difference between your 8-hour-a-day job and sleeping to a
Yeah,
device looks really similar.
yeah, the Fitbit does not, it can't distinguish between those two really. So yeah, I understand why it works that way. And yeah, really to get good, solid, like, sleep analytical data, you need to have all sorts of electrodes wired up to your head anyway. So it's like no at home wearable is ever going to give you the same kind of sleep analysis that you get if you actually go to a sleep lab and like do an overnight sleep study, which I've had to do a couple different times just because I've
Yeah.
got a mild to moderate sleep apnea. But
Let me ask you this. This is one of those topics, I'd love to sort of get further into, like, what would we want from a wearable, sort of more speculative conversation, but I think we'll save that one for another time. The one thing I want to ask briefly, since this is clearly the one function we all have experience with, regardless of which device we're using, is the step counting thing. And I'm curious to know whether or not having a device that count your steps has been a motivator for you to exercise. I can tell you that from my own experience, when I got a Fitbit, I'm like, oh, this will be great. I really didn't care at the end of the day. Has it had has a better effect on any of you guys in terms of fitness tracking?
I mean, in terms, I mean, I don't like, because when I wear my watch, I'm not like more motivated to do it, but I am kind of like, at the end of the day, I'll just kind of look down and press the button on my watch and see like, oh wow,
Yeah.
15,000 steps. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
So it's
that's kind
kind
of
of
where I
cool.
land with it too.
It's kind of cool just to see it. And I mean,
I did a more scientific thing. I have created like a spreadsheet, and I'll track every week my weight, the distance that I've traveled, walking, whatever, blood pressure, and sort of correlating those things between each other to see what I need to do to get better results towards my health.
Really?
Tracking sleep counts for that too. So I actually have started a more scientific, and I've been tracking it for over a year, and I'll bring it to my doctor and stuff, and she'll get all excited.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yep.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think I'm sort of halfway in between. I think I'd like to get myself to the point where I'm doing more what Keith's doing. I mean, I think that the reason I bought it is, after having a couple of conversations with my doctor about needing to be a little bit more mindful of the fact that I'm in my 40s. I'm not leading the world's most athletic lifestyle.
I got the "you're gonna die" speech. Yeah.
um, and so just having the ability to just look at a metric and sort of see just how much, or more frequently how little actual exercise I'm getting. It does help me, at least as far as being mindful about it. I'm not going to say that it is the end all be all of motivators, but it's something that when I'm thinking about it, I can look at it and see whether or not things I'm doing to try to be better about that are actually paying off.
Yeah.
So it's more about just having the data available and being mindful about it. And if I'm wearing it, I might be more inclined to think about wearing it if I know I'm going to be going out for if I'm running around Cambridge and know I'm going to be walking for a bit. I'll make absolutely sure I've got my Fitbit on.
Yeah. Cool. Well, look, this seems like a good place to stop it. I personally think that this is a topic, the whole wearables thing, that is definitely one I want to revisit at some point. Like I said earlier, maybe getting more into the speculative thing, and maybe look at some other hardware and stuff that we aren't personally using but are intriguing us and things like that. But for now, let's put a pin on it. We'll come back to it.
Cool.
Sounds good.
Sweet.
Hey, thanks for listening to Geek Tangent. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please send us an email at contact@geek-tangent.com. While you're at it, you can stay in touch with us by liking our Facebook page. You can find that at facebook.com/geektangentpodcast.
All right, welcome back, everybody. It's time for us to play Podcast Inception, where we talk about a podcast on a podcast. And we're going to talk about some different podcasts all of us like, each of us like, and maybe even a different take on podcasts from Stefan. So one of the podcasts I'm really into, and I know Chris hates these guys, but Giant Bomb is the podcast that I cannot wait for every week, because the hosts are just so really engaging, and it kind of lets me geek out on games without having to do it in front of people. I can do it in my car, which makes me feel pretty good.
Yeah.
And they always seem like super unbiased when they're reviewing or playing games. And I think the biggest thing that I like about the show is that they make me want to play different kinds of games. Like, I feel like if I'm on a marketplace and I'm searching through games, I'm just going to levitate towards like sports games and first person shooters and that stuff. But the way they kind of like break down games, and all the hosts like such a different variety of games, that there's a lot of like different games I want to try. Like, I want to try some puzzle games now. I want to try some like simulator games. I want to try some real time strategy games, and that's just stuff I've never would have thought um, to even look into, because I just never interested in them before, and I never really knew much about them.
That's high praise for a podcast, by the
But
way, to
they're really
make you
good.
open up. And
Plus, they're just like they're just funny, and like I think they're all kind of a little sarcastic, and they all kind of have some funny takes on weird shit that happens in gaming stories. They even can spend 20 minutes talking about, trucking in gaming. They had like 20 minutes of an episode where they just talked about truckers who have like these console setups in their semis, and they like pull over and play for like hours. And they just talked about it, and it's just cool to hear. It's not IGN, it's not Kotaku, getting paid to talk about Call of Duty, or slandering Bethesda or Bungie because they fuck something up. It's just like guys talking about games, and I think it's pretty cool.
Can I issue a mea culpa? Despite, I'll tell you the reason why I have trouble getting into Giant Bombcast is the same reason I have getting into some other podcasts as well. Is just because they're so long, and
Oh,
my
it's so good though, dude. It's like just 3 hours is like that's like 3 days for a commute for me, because I drive. So it's like,
well, yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. My commute's much shorter, so and that sort of ties into my. And I don't want to go. I don't want to tangent too far off on this, but
yes,
I
you
find
do.
that I listen to so many different podcasts that it becomes like a to-do list. I
Hmm.
always have a new episode, and I can never just go, well, I'm just going to skip that one. I always feel compelled to listen to it. And so when you're juggling, eight or so podcasts a week, when there's that one that's sitting in your list that's like 2.5 hours, that alone is just like, I just can't do it. Now, having said that, here's the mea culpa part. I actually just started listening to Giant Beastcast.
Yeah,
I actually like it. I like it.
that's the
It's
East
more.
Coast counterpart. Yeah.
Exactly. I just discovered it recently. I don't remember where I saw a mention of it, but it is generally a bit shorter. It's about an hour, I think, maybe an hour and a half. And that's like sort of my threshold. So I'm like, okay, I'll give that a try. And I've listened to the 2 or so most recent episodes, and I do like that. So maybe my thing about the Bombcast is just that it's just too much for me to feel like I can digest.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
When I
But yeah,
listen to those 2 and longer hour podcasts, like I listen to Rage Select, and he'll go for 2 hours easily. I don't sit and listen 2 hours at once. I'll listen 20 minutes here, 20 minutes there, 30 minutes there. It'll take me days to listen to one of those.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that was actually one thing I was going to ask you guys is like, because as Doug alluded to in his intro, I actually don't listen to podcasts that much. I think largely because it never really fit into my commute type. Because
Yeah,
I have, my commute has always been, walk 10 minutes to a subway station, ride the subway for 10 minutes, and then walk another 10 minutes to my physical office. And so the
yeah.
fact that it's broken up like that, it doesn't lend itself well to listening to a podcast while I'm commuting.
Hmm.
And as a software engineer, trying to listen to a podcast while I'm writing code that's just a level of multitasking too far for me personally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
you
I was
can't
just
pay
curious, like,
attention.
when do you guys actually do most of your podcast listening?
I'm so glad you asked. I'll tell you. The commute thing is the big one for me, but unlike Doug, my commute's shorter. It's about a half hour start to finish, so it's not that bad. Um, but the other time I always listen to podcasts is when I'm doing house chores.
Yeah.
If I'm vacuuming or I'm doing the dishes or I'm folding laundry, all that mundane stuff, I can't do it unless I'm listening to a podcast. And it makes a world of difference because it's a tedious job in the first place. And there's something about the directness of having earbuds in and listening to something like that that's engaging but doesn't require focus like a movie.
yeah.
If you're going to
Right.
be watching a movie while you're doing that stuff, it's too. So those are my places, and they're really great places for me to be listening to
Yeah,
podcasts personally.
yeah, and like Keith, like Chris said, I definitely do mine on the commute. I mean, I have an hour or two and an hour back with traffic, so that's an episode of you know most of the podcasts I listen to. It's 2 hours.
Doug and
Um,
I are farmers of the largest crop in the United States of America, which is grass. So, like, I don't know if Doug cuts his own grass. I do.
yeah, I do.
So,
Yeah.
oftentimes I'll listen to podcasts while I'm doing yard work.
Yep. It's a weird
Uh,
thing too. It's like at some point, uh, when I got to a certain age, I just stopped listening to music on the radio. I don't know
Yeah,
what it is,
yeah,
but
totally.
Well, radio sucks now.
but I could play my iPod or I could play my phone music on my phone. But I find just like listening to someone talk is way better when I'm driving. I don't know what it
Yeah.
is, but
Yep.
yeah,
Next thing you know, you're going to be
I tend
listening
to
to
default to
NPR.
just listen to NPR, yeah,
yeah,
rather than necessarily
yeah. But then
seeking
it's
out a
like I
specific
gotta like pretend to
podcast.
be smart and stuff. I just want to listen to a video game podcast.
Fair enough. So I've got a podcast that I discovered not too long ago, and I got to be honest with you, I have a slightly difficult time describing what it is. So I'll start with what I thought it was, and then describe
Well, how about you
briefly what
start
I
with the
think.
title?
I'm about to tell you. Don't get all impatient on me. One of the podcasts that I'm really enjoying is one called Off Camera. And it's an interview show hosted by a professional photographer named Sam Jones. He's based out of California. I think he's in LA. And he's about our age, somewhere in his mid 40s, something like that. And he shoots, by his own description, a variety of things. He does a lot of fashion stuff, a lot of magazine spreads and things like that. But his career has gotten him in touch with a whole bunch of well known people, artists, musicians, designers, all that kind of stuff. And so a couple of years ago, he started his own podcast. It's basically an interview show, and it's specifically intended to be sort of an open-ended thing. Like, let's not have you come in because you're pimping your latest movie. Let's sit down and talk about like how you became an actor or whatever it is, what your process is, and it's really, really interesting because you realize you rarely get to hear these people go that in depth. And he doesn't get dumb people like, some ding dong actor or musician with no depth or whatever. He gets very interesting people in, and he manages to spur really interesting conversations with them.
Yeah,
Really
that's cool.
fascinating stuff. At the same time, he's also shooting a video of the interview, and it's in black and white, and it's just a simple two people sitting at a chair. It's a very nice looking, well shot, well framed video, and they post that as well. And I only recently found out that they actually publish, I think it's a magazine or a newsletter of some sort for each episode, because I guess after they do the interview, they then go do a photo shoot, which I haven't seen any of that stuff, but just the quality of the interviewing is really amazing, and I can't recommend it highly enough. They have a lot. You're bound to find somebody you're interested in, whether it's Will Ferrell or Robert Downey Jr. or a whole host of other people, some of whom I've never heard of either, but they're always very interesting.
I'm literally gonna watch this. I'm gonna listen to this tomorrow because I'm looking at the covers right now and they are amazing.
Aren't they great? Yeah, the guy does
Oh,
some great
the
work.
people he's got on there, like
Yeah.
Jackson Brown and like
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
yeah, there's a lot of
Dave
people.
Grohl was the one that hooked me into it. He did one of his early episodes with Dave Grohl.
It's cool. It looks really cool. It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
so it's definitely worth a listen. I just listen to it as a podcast, but of course, like I said, there are videos and things you can also consume for free. And to top it all off, he's a super nice guy. I actually tweeted him a couple of weeks ago about something or other. He wrote right back. I'm like, oh my god, so it's
Yeah,
kind
that's
of
cool.
cool. Yeah, he genuinely seems like a really nice guy. So off camera, can't recommend it highly
Very
enough.
cool.
Cool.
Nice. Well, I'm going to throw one out there. As you guys know, maybe not all the listeners know, I enjoy drinking beer every day. You should drink 1 or 2 beers a day. You will live longer. That's true. So the podcast I'm going to throw out there is The Beerists. And it's something that I started listening to out of listening to something else. There used to be part of Hollywood.com. There was a website called Spill, and it was a bunch of animators in Austin, Texas. And they used to do a movie review cable access TV show way back when that was a thing, like Wayne's World, called The Real Deal. Get it? REEL movies. And anyway, that died, and they went over to a podcast, and it just grew into all these other different podcasts. So one of them was a video game podcast called The Loading Bar that I'd listened to, and that's became Rage Select that I still listen to. One of those things was called The Beerists, and it's run by a guy named John Rubio, and he'll have 2 or 3 other people. They'll typically review 4 or 5 beers a week. Sometimes there's a theme, sometimes there's not. Sometimes they're all from the same brewery. Sometimes the brewer is there to explain, what hops they used, whether something was aged or not, or blah, 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 what kind of yeast. They'll talk about the flavor profile. They'll give you all the statistics of the, alcohol content, international bittering units, all that kind of stuff. It's interesting if you, want to learn more about beer and experiment with what's out there. And it's interesting and it's funny. By the end of the show, of course, everyone's starting to get a little tanked, and they'll run down like their ratings in order. I like this one the best, and by the end of it, it's very jokey, and they're teasing each other and making fun of each other. It's a good time. And whatever, you learn a little bit about beer, and hopefully you discover some new ones you might like to try. I think it's a fun podcast.
I think this is what we're missing. We need to be drinking while we record this.
Yeah, exactly.
What, you mean you guys aren't?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right?
I know. Actually, come to think of it, I should go open a beer. No, but that sounds really cool.
It is good. It's worth giving a listen. It's on iTunes, of course, but there's a website, The Beerists, and yeah, check it out. It's fun.
Cool. Sweet.
Yeah, so to conclude this segment, as I alluded to earlier, I don't really spend that much time listening to podcasts, podcasts, but
Apart from this one.
well, apart from this one, of course, and that's largely because the time that I would arguably be spending listening to podcasts, I'm probably more often just listening to straight NPR. Boston's WBUR is a really good NPR station, and so that tends to be my default. If I want to have background noise, something I can be listening to that doesn't require necessarily my full attention, that tends
Yeah.
to be what I go to. But there are some programs on that where if I like only catch part of an episode, or if I've missed a week's episode, I'll go and find the podcast of that episode, and listen to it that way. So I usually, my podcasts are more to kind of like fill in gaps of things that I missed as part of the regular broadcast schedule. And so if I had to single out one, that I'm sure all three of you guys have at least heard an episode or two of this, either on the air or as a podcast. But The Moth, the True Stories Told
Yeah.
Live.
Yeah, that's a
Um,
good one.
yeah, I just find some of those stories really, really fascinating and entertaining and interesting to listen to. And also, I wanted to shout out to them because their artistic director, Catherine Burns, is actually someone I used to work with at the Wild Wild Web.
Oh,
Huh,
cool.
She
small
was
world.
a producer for us back then in the late '90s, and she's now the artistic director for The Moth, and she'll actually occasionally be the an episode host where she will introduce the individual storytellers. So it's kind of fun to have that connection to it as well. So
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
that's
cool.
totally cool. The Moth is one of those that on paper, yeah, you're right, Doug, Stefan, excuse me. I'm totally familiar with it. And on paper, it's one of those that like wouldn't interest me at all. Storytelling, it's sort of like around the campfire type thing. But I have to admit, whenever I've found myself on the dial and it's there, it's just completely engrossing. Some of the story, I mean, I've literally like cried in the car because somebody's telling some horrible, some terrible life story that, had a silver lining or something like that. But boy, it obviously the whole point of the show is to like illuminate the art of storytelling, and they do a great job of it.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously anything that makes it as far as getting to the radio, they've done a fair amount of curating, and yeah, they'll admit as much that they'll often sit down with a storyteller and kind of help them hone how they tell that story, um,
Ah,
without not obviously, as their tagline says, true stories told live as remembered by the people telling them. Yeah, so they're not trying to necessarily change the core of what the story being told is, but just sort of help the storyteller, find the flow of the story that makes it, as compelling as it possibly can be.
Speaking of
Um,
the flow in a similar vein, you should check out Snap Judgment. Um,
I, I've
similar,
I've I've only more recently discovered them that they air on BUR as well,
yeah,
and yeah, some of those are also very, very interesting.
great
cool.
show.
Last question for you, Stefan, and maybe one of you other guys knows this as well. The Moth, as an organization, are they based out of Chicago?
I'm pretty sure they
Do you
got
have
their
any idea?
start in New York.
Okay, okay. Because I
Um,
know they do like tours around the country now, and that's where they record their shows from. I mean,
yeah,
they've blown through Boston a couple of times.
yeah, they do regional story slams. And actually, Chris, a mutual friend of ours, Bethany,
Yep.
I know
Yeah, I
has
know.
occasionally, like at a lot of Moth events. It depends on, they've got a number of different types of events. There's story slams and grand. I think they call them grand slams, but
Mhm.
um, at a number of their events, you can put your name in a hat to to basically volunteer to potentially be asked to tell a 5-minute story that night.
Yeah,
And yeah, there's no guarantee that you'll get drawn, but it's the kind of thing where part of the structure of a Moth story slam is some level of completely unvetted audience participation of people just coming up and volunteering to tell stories. They do also do like larger, more tour events where some of the people who tell stories that you hear on the radio are
yeah.
retelling those stories in a live context. Uh,
Interesting.
so it's a number of different types of events, but I'm pretty sure they got started out of New York.
Gotcha. Well, it occurs to me there's no better way to end this podcast by sending off listeners with a handful of other podcasts to listen to, just like
Yeah,
this. So this seems like kind of the perfect place to end this episode of Geek Tangent. What do you say?
yep.
Cool.
Listen to Geek
Cool.
Tangent too, though. It's good.
Yes, exactly. Put that on your constant rotation. So listen, we're going to wrap up this episode. Thanks for listening. And always, you can get in touch with us at contact@geek-tangent.com. You can find us on iTunes. That's probably the easiest place to subscribe to the show. And by all means, if you listen to a few episodes in and you don't hate us, leave us a review of some kind. Really appreciate it. It's actually one of the few, if only, ways that other people can find it. And by all means, recommend us to your friends if you want. Until then, we'll see you next time on Geek Tangent 2 weeks from today. Adios.
I see dead people.